Thank you everyone for joining today. It's a pleasure to be joined here by some excellent speakers. Stuart Carroll from Moderna is joining us. He's just stuck in a minor security breach, I believe, in the road surrounding us, but he will be here very soon. But I can crack on with my opening remarks, and I'm sure he will join us very soon. So it is an absolute pleasure to be joined. Oh, by the way, my name's Rosie. I always forget to introduce myself. My name's Rosie Beacon. I'm the research manager at Reform and head of health. It's great to be joined by some excellent speakers who have got some brilliant views on the life sciences industry, and it will be great to discuss the progress that's been made since the Life Sciences Vision was published 2 years ago. It really is impossible to think about the future of health without thinking about the future of life sciences. All of our lives will have been transformed by the innovation produced by this industry. And while life sciences has been improving and indeed prolonging our lives for a very long time, it was really put on the map amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, as I'm sure you're all aware, and ultimately providing the single most significant intervention, which was the COVID-19 vaccine, ultimately enabling us to resume normal life again. And here in the UK, life sciences has long been a unique strength of ours. We have a substantial comparative advantage in our world-leading universities, our unparalleled data sets, and 2 of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. And while the pandemic was a remarkable testament to the contribution that life sciences makes to the improvement of both our health and our wealth, there is always a risk of complacency, and is essentially to continually reflect on the gaps in the system and what could need to be improved. And it is fair to say that the government have recognised this. Indeed, the review done by one of our panellists, Lord O'Shaughnessy, recognised that while we punch above our weight, we are increasingly held back by particular persistent issues with commercial clinical trials. And it means that the attractiveness of major and unique assets to the UK, such as the UK Biobank, could be undermined by slow and bureaucratic clinical trial approval processes. And this is markedly relevant as you look to the US, Spain or Australia, who have cut weeks back from their approval processes compared to us. And it feels like an especially pertinent time to discuss this, as yesterday the Autumn Statement allocated £20 million to accelerating clinical trials for dementia treatments. And yesterday as well, the government also published their updated response for the review done by Lord O'Shaughnessy. So it is especially convenient we have some excellent panellists to help us discuss it. So on my left and to your right, I'm delighted to be joined by George Freeman, who was until very recently the Minister of State in the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. We have Lord O'Shaughnessy, who's already received 2 mentions in my opening remarks, who recently wrote a review on clinical trials and was a Health Minister from 2016 to 2018. And Dame Jean Raine, who is the CEO of the Medicines Healthcare and Regulatory Agency, and Stuart Carroll, who, as I previously alluded to, will be here very soon, who is the Director of Market Access and Policy Affairs at Moderna. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I'm going to pass over to George Freeman to start us off with his opening remarks.
Right, wow. Thank you, Rosie, very much, and thanks all for coming. You've got some pretty distinguished folks here. There's almost no problem this group can't solve. So this is my first event on life sciences since leaving office, so I'm free to speak, and grateful for Reform, who've been on healthcare for many years. I can't think of another think tank that has been more persistent in pushing the case. And of course, crucially, the life science industry and the productivity of the NHS go hand in hand, and Reform has always got that, has always understood that we will never have a modern health service. We will never have a productive health economy if we don't dramatically increase the deeper relationship between innovation, digital as well as pharmaceutical. So great to be here, particularly with James and June, who've done probably more than anyone between them. There's a group of us who've tried to do our best. And Nicole, who back in the day, when we set up the first original life science strategy, Nicole came over and ran the Office for Life Science. So let me just, a few reflections. Firstly, you hear a lot about these days from people saying government's very short term, we never do anything long term, we never think ahead. I'd like to suggest that in this sector, actually this country has demonstrated an ability to think long term. It was Peter Mandelson and David Sainsbury back in the tail end of the last New Labour government who started to get this going in government, set up the OLS. When David Willits and I came in 2010 after a 15-year career doing early stage venture, 4 years of VC, started an AI toxicology business, and then 7 years working around universities, putting together hospital, university and industry partnerships. When David Willits and I arrived in 2010, the OLS had been closed by the officials during the general election. Quite extraordinary. And David and I walked around going, where is the Office for Life Science actually? And that just tells you something about how departmental, siloed and vertical Whitehall is. I think in my dream state I'd have 6 departments, a big foreign one, a big businessy, financy one, a big health, welfare, lifestyle, society one, but anyway. So David and I re-established the Office for Life Science. We had 7 people in 2010, and it's now 100 people working properly across government, linking DH, DCIT, and DET. And people who work in OLS, their first loyalty is to OLS, and it's a great model. They also work very strongly with other departments, but I just make that point. And I was the first Minister for Life Science. You remember I used to give the speech, I hope I'm not the last. There was a different problem which I didn't foresee, which was that there'd be 9 after me in about 6 years. And we do need some stability. And I would just make the point, I think having the role I defined with David Cameron was that you have to have a minister at DH. I was responsible for, it was extraordinary, he let me write the portfolio. Responsible for NIHR, the drugs budget, MHRA, NICE, the specials, all of the things you want to have. And at Department of Business, you need to be responsible for the Office for Life Science, the international investment piece, and I have a proper minister who covers both. And we've lost that. And I just put that point down. I think it's that's a shame. The truth is we've come a huge distance in the last 15 years on any metric. I mean, mine was on biotech financing. The last year I was in the private sector. UK biotechs raised 45 million on the public markets, public and private markets. Last year, 4.5 billion. It was huge growth. It was a huge growth. The big problem we've got is, of course, on the commercial side that, well, there are 2 big ones. One in Cambridge when I left. How many companies were there, mid-caps, at scale, going global, non-big pharma? There were 4. How many are there now? 3. We've been incubating NASDAQ very, very effectively, and we've had some amazing success stories, and some great companies have made money and built revenues, but I mean, that is clearly a huge problem if we really want to scale. But I think the bigger problem, and the one that I'm now going to be back focusing on, is how we really show the country, the NHS, Department of Health, that this sector is not a cost. It is utterly fundamental to the transformation of 21st century healthcare. We need to do that before we get into the 22nd century. It is completely key to early diagnosis, to smarter treatments, to personalised therapies, to easing the burden of bureaucracy and all of that, which is literally, I used to give speeches back in the day saying the NHS will make or break us. Right now, it's in danger of breaking us. And this is urgent, and Wes Streeting gets it, to his credit, and he's going to be brave, I think. And we may talk about that, but in the end, my view formed over 30 years is that it's time to really properly localise, incentivise and integrate healthcare. And I look at my own county of Norfolk. We have 3 hospitals, we have 5 CCGs, we have a mental health trust, an ambulance trust, a community health trust, an ICB. We have 14 healthcare organisations, 5 are in special measures. There aren't 15 sets of leaders in a place like that. We need one Norfolk healthcare system. And I think if you had proper incentives and said, look, if we reward people to empty the hospitals, not fill them up, and allow people to keep some of those savings, I think we have 1,000 flowers bloom of local leadership. So that's sort of radical thought on the model. If there are incentives, people will reach for innovation. At the moment, if you deliver more for less, we give you less. and if you keep your hospital full, we reward you. So the structural economics are all wrong, I think. Last point I'd make is when I finally returned to this portfolio in February, having frustratingly been fired by Dominic Cummings the morning, February the 14th, the morning after the first COBRA meeting on the pandemic, which I attended, and thought this is about to test the health economics, the health economic expertise of this country in a way that is never, and I was fired having said something about Brexit 9 months earlier. So it's pretty frustrating watching, and I just wish this review was focusing more on the real lessons about data, about transparency, about why 20-odd thousand people died more than should have done, about population health, about all of that, the real health economics, rather than the tittle-tattle of which politician was rude about another one. But I just made the point, when I came back in February, I sat down immediately with JB, John Simmons, Ros, looked at the dashboard indicators, and quite a lot of them were red, amber. The obvious one was clinical trials. It was just flashing red, that we immediately decided, hang on a minute, we had just got to really move the dial. James had done a brilliant bit of work. We sat for 3 hours in the Treasury and decided we're just going to fund the whole thing. So £650 million in pretty short order was a big commitment, and when I went to Bio, I got the impression if we hadn't done that, there would have been a roar of people saying, have you any idea, George, how rapidly the clinical trials piece is collapsing? So it's completely key, not least because we've signed big legal agreements with companies like Moderna and BioNTech and others to put about 50,000 people into trials in the next 3 years. So it's completely key. But the other ones I just flag, VPAS was clearly, as ever, the running sore, and I hope we've landed in the right zone. There isn't a sweet spot that everyone will love, but as long as we land the helicopter vaguely on the edge, and the pricing is fair and reasonable, then I think everything else comes back into play, and boy, is everything else huge. So the investment we made in genomics, the investment, the work that we're doing through the missions, the life science missions, really transformational programs, so that the NHS and DH are properly committed to embracing life science on key chronic disease burdens. I think there's some really good stuff going on, and the AI investments all very exciting. But unless we quickly demonstrate, I think, the vision we set out 10 years ago, that the NHS will never pay top dollar, but will give industry something better, which is quicker access to patients, quicker access to tissues, quicker access to places. So you get a validation. Our diagnostic device, drug, proven to work, healthy from the MHRA, effective from NICE. And the more we can give that, the less industry will clatter down the door for price. And most of the early stage emerging companies, price isn't irrelevant. It's validation they need. And that was the thinking behind the accelerated access reform. And I think that offers us still a really powerful model. So in the boardrooms around the world, people say, yeah, you wouldn't go to the UK for the top price. You'd go because that's the best place to get quick validation, quick data, stratify, work out which patients you should be in. And I think that linked to the clinical trials piece, two sides of the same coin, is very, very exciting. The one thing we haven't done, I really think we have to, and James touched on this, is properly digitalise portals. I used to call them patient portals, by disease and by place. So I dream of the day when I get my diabetes diagnosis. It won't be very long, I'm sure. That they say, bad news, George, you've got diabetes. Good news, you've now got your own personalised, secure login to the diabetes portal. It's not run by the NHS, but it's integrated with. It's run by the charities, actually, Diabetes UK. You can find, you can enrol in trials. You can slide the Freeman consent bar, share my data with researchers through the charities. You can find people in your neighbourhood who've got diabetes. You can get fit. And I think if we could digitalise at that end, we'd give our economy the chance to say to industry, would you like 500,000 diabetes patients with red hair and early onset this or that? And we find them, they're there. And we could speed it up dramatically through charities, because I think trying to speed it up dramatically through a system that's under real pressure is quite hard. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Well, follow that.
that. Well, I suppose I am one of those 9 life sciences ministers that's been following in George's slipstream ever since. And genuinely, George, you have been an inspiration for those of us that have followed, and I'm sure we're not going to lose that marvellous brain of yours to this wonderful sector. Rosie, thank you very much for hosting us today. Thank you to Reform for the event. I think it is absolutely right that this is a reform event. This is a public service, if we want to think about it in that way, in health and its interaction with life sciences in desperate need of reform. And it is important to view those two things together, as you said in your opening. If you actually think about the size of the life sciences sector in the UK, it's about 100 billion or so. And then you think about the size of the NHS, that's about, across the 4 countries of the UK, that's about 180 billion. You then add in the private sector care, think about consumer health and wellness, think about digital care and so on. We're talking about a sector or a collection of sectors that probably account for about 20% of the economy. And just to step back for a minute, if you think about any long-term success story for the UK economy, it has to be predicated on this combination of this interaction and integration between our health and life sciences sector. If we are not good at this, and as George said, there are some warning signs out there that we have been declining our performance over various. If we are not good at this, we will not be a success as an economy. We will get progressively poorer over time. Now, it's not the only industry. We've got great strengths in financial services and fintech. You think about clean energy and so on. But this is one of the 3, which is why I am a profound believer in the importance of industrial strategies, whether we talk about them publicly or as Conservatives want to do, not to talk about them publicly. But we have to think about this as an industry that we foster, and indeed that is so much of what George has been doing over time. Now, as you mentioned, Rosie, I was asked to look at one little bit of it. In fact, I was asked to look at one little bit of it, because the clinical trials sector itself, we enrol, and June will have the up-to-date numbers, we enrol about 1 million people into clinical trials every year, and only around 5% actually is slipped, hence the fact of a review on commercial trials. But they act as a sort of warning indicator in a way about the health or otherwise of our system, because they reflect the degree to which those life sciences industries, the pharmaceutical companies and smaller biotechs, want to come and do business here, both because it's an attractive environment in which to do the trial itself, but also because companies are not want to bring trials to countries where they're not going to get reimbursed, or where they're going to get reimbursed at the price that they don't like. So if things are going wrong in commercial clinical trials, it probably says that something's going wrong more generally. And so that, in a way, is the purpose of the fact, or the realisation on which the review was predicated. Something had been going wrong. Activity had decreased by over 40% between 2017 and 2022. What were we going to do about it? What were the reasons for that? And I won't rehearse, you will be pleased to say, all 27 recommendations of the review, but suffice it to say that you can kind of break down the problem statements into 3 or 4 issues, one of which is just the speed of setting up and having approved trials. And June's going to talk more about this, I'm sure, but we had slid down the international league tables, actually, I think, for reasons of, I'm going to, as an ex-minister too, describe it as an act of bureaucratic vandalism of taking money away from one of the best functioning bits of our life sciences sector, the MHRA post-COVID, and not giving them the tools to do the job. That is now being addressed, and performance has dramatically increased. But it's also true that it's very slow and painful to set up trials at a local level. The second area is almost that kind of classic public sector reform theme, which is around transparency and accountability. It's slightly gone out of vogue, George. I don't know if you've noticed.
Yeah.
When we came in 2010, we had all these we published data on everything, and crime maps and this sort of thing. It's incredibly hard to find out what's happening in clinical trials in the UK. A government review was predicated on private sector data. That's not a good sign. We ought to know in real time what's going on, because if you don't know, you can't hold people to accountable, you can't overinvest in the places that are doing well, and you can't challenge and support those that are doing badly. There's a whole other area which I'm going to return to, which is just how research is seen within the NHS itself. It needs to be seen as a fundamental part of healthcare rather than just a kind of bolt-on, which, if only we had time, we'd do more of. There's then a set of issues around data, which I think are really important, and I just want to dwell on a little bit, which is, and George, you and I will have had this experience, and many others in the room. The UK is always talking about the value of its health data assets. I sit on the board of Health Data Research UK, and we will often go to international conferences and tell pharma companies and others, we've got these brilliant data assets, and they will say, great, when do we get to use them? And we haven't really, in fact, you could almost argue that we made more false steps than we have positive ones in the last few years in actually getting those data assets into a usable form. We have, again, amazing initiatives, Biobank, Our Future Health, and so on. But we've also had things like the GPDPR fiasco. We had Carroll data 10 years ago, which kind of reduced confidence in the ability to do this. Now, I think things are changing. We understand that this whole area actually isn't a technical problem. It's a human problem. It's a socio-cultural problem around trust. And you have to go out and engage with patients and tell them what's happening, or indeed not even tell them, ask them what they think should happen and give them the chance to do that. And when that happens, you break through all these kind of strange, actually almost imagined barriers that we put in the way, that we blame on things like GDPR and so on, that stop data sharing, to mean that we can actually go to people without asking in advance whether they would like to be contacted if it looks like they might be eligible for a trial, or indeed that we can join up data about somebody if they are in a trial, so they can pluck that data from primary care, secondary care and elsewhere, which provides this amazingly rich data set that we can assemble about people in this country now. And that genuinely is world leading, particularly when you add it to the very heterogeneous nature of our population, which means we've got every genotype, every phenotype and genotype in the world in one country, which ought to be a huge strength of ours. The final thing we have is we just need to make more use of our primary care assets. Most people who go onto clinical trials look like me, and I am not representative of the United Kingdom. So we need to find ways of bringing trials to people through primary care, through community care and so on, so that we actually start to rebuild trust in research, as well as using research as a tool to close the health equity gap. So that was the sort of very brief canter around the kind of problem statements and a load of recommendations around that, which you would have seen yesterday. I'm really delighted to say continued backing from the government and proper money, 120 million plus of the package that George mentioned, to improve that. And as we've seen, huge leaps forward in MHRA approvals, in national contracting costing, and a few other areas, even in the last 6 months. But there is one area, or it's two sort of thoughts to leave you with. One is the role of the NHS, and I mentioned that. And I think we do have a problem, which is, if you go back to the long-term plan in 2018, there are 2.5 pages on research. And I was a minister at the time, and I was responsible for research, and when we saw the first draft, it was 1.5 pages, so a 66% increase in content. Brilliant. Not really good enough, though, is it? Let's face it. And the NHS doesn't routinely measure the amount of R&D activity that happens within it. It's meant to be, you know, again, come back to where I started, the cornerstone of one of our greatest industries, and we don't actually know how much R&D activity is happening. I can tell you it's not enough, because we did do an exercise 5 years ago, and it was about 1.7, 1.8%. I can't imagine it's a lot greater now. Economy-wide, we're about 2.7%. So that tells you how far off we have. And I have this kind of dream that Amanda Pritchard will stand up and say, I want the NHS to become the world's leading platform for R&D, and actually to follow it through. And I've never been able to persuade the chief executive of the NHS England to do that. So that continues to be a work in progress. But we really do need a cultural change, as well as all the sort of technical changed incentives and all of that kind of stuff. It actually comes from the top, and how important research is. And then the final thing is just step back and, is the way we fund research the right way to do it? So recommendation right at the end about something which was called in the review Clinical Trial Accelerator Networks, but which has now currently got a slightly different acronym, but it doesn't really matter. It's called accelerators, which is, I'm not convinced that just doling out money on a regional basis to people who are already doing what they do and allowing them to continue what they do is the right way to do things. And I'll tell you why, for 2 reasons. First of all, if you have a disease, where you live is not the most important thing about you as a patient, it's what disease you've got. And if you're a drug company, or a medical device company, digital health company, you're looking for people not in a certain place, but with a certain disease. But most of our infrastructure is based on place. Now, in many ways, place is important, of course, but actually in this instance, it's the least interesting thing about you. And yet, we don't, if you look at networks within NIHR and so on around disease areas, they're very weak. I don't mean the people anymore weak, they're usually outstanding, but we don't create platforms around that. So we need to take a different approach which actually funds platforms and accelerators within disease areas. And I'm thrilled that we have two now nominated as a result of yesterday. The first is attached to the dementia mission, which George has already mentioned, and the second is around cancer vaccines, which Stuart will talk about, which effectively wraps up some of the work, the really outstanding work actually, the entrepreneurial work that the government and NHS England have been doing in striking these deals with Moderna and BioNTech and others. But I think we need more of that. We need to find ways to reward that latent entrepreneurialism that totally exists in the NHS as well as in the wider economy, and use that to dramatically increase the amount of clinical trials. And I set this kind of stretching target of doubling our clinical trial activity by 2025 and doubling again. We are more than capable of doing that, but it will take an effort. But I think if we do it, it will be that light will be flashing green again, alongside all the other great stuff, which I'm sure we'll get into, that is happening, and that will draw money. The thing we need more than anything is somebody else's money being invested in this country, not just taxpayers being redistributed, somebody else's money. And there are hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds worth of investment every year waiting for us if we get our act together.
Great, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Big thanks to Rosie and to Reform for the invitation. And I think it is great 2 years on to look at the life sciences vision and say, is it still fit for purpose, or do we need to do something different? And what I'd like to convince everyone of today is that it is most certainly not gathering dust. I think the big question, and I'm looking at the wall over there, is knowing the vision is not enough, says the quote, we must apply. Willing is not enough, we must do. So it's a good point at which to take a look to see how well we're doing, and particularly well timed, and congratulations to Reform, given the resounding vote of confidence from the Chancellor yesterday. He really does get it, and I couldn't be more grateful to all the colleagues who've maybe had some influence on that we can see in black and white exactly where we're going to be putting our investments. But when we talk about regulation, and usually a cloud descends on the room, it is not the most exciting of subjects. So when I opened that vision and I read, we are going to see an overarching ambition to use the opportunity of Brexit to deliver a progressive UK regulatory offer, unleashing innovation in regulatory processes. Actually, my heart leapt. I thought, this is my life. It's going to be what we're going to do over the next few years, providing an aligned, integrated and simple regulatory journey for companies to engage with. We have got to make it so straightforward to go from discovery to deployment and to gather that data that Lord O'Shaughnessy's has talked about. So just to have our eye on where we are now, and I think there are some splendid examples. We're authorising new drugs in the life sciences missions. We're seeing drugs coming through for obesity, for cancer, a very healthy pipeline on dementia. You've seen the world's first CRISPR technology, gene therapy for sickle cell disease. We are getting there to show that an agile regulator is not a contradiction in terms. We've got an AI airlock, and please don't question me too much on that. It's our sandbox version 2, where you can generate data on AI, and actually it will be regulatory proved data for getting these vibrant products into the NHS, transformative products. And more than that, we're looking at the pathway for immunotherapy, setting an international standard for the cancer vaccines in terms of point of care manufacture. So you have your tumour excised, your DNA is, the tumour DNA is there, you're getting your immunotherapy, your cancer vaccine immediately. We can do this. And as I've just come back from Australia, talking about what countries will do in this space, we are leading the charge. So let's rejoice in where we are now. But I couldn't be honest unless I said there's a lot more to do. And the way we're doing it is in terms of process, in terms of partners, performance and people. Process means, and I look to any currently active parliamentarians, getting some legislation on the statute book for for point-of-care manufacture, for clinical trials, and for medtech, including AI and diagnostics.
Sign me up.
And
I'm now free to table legislation.
actively going to push. And clearly we've got a new ministerial team and we're getting to know them very well, thanks to the Life Sciences Council. And this has got to be, again, it might sound a bit techie, but we have to change the law to make sure that personalised products that come from a platform, not a marketing authorisation, Euro style, we authorise a platform, not a product. These are big cultural shifts. And secondly, we do it in an international way. We know that we want to create a USP for the UK. That is, we do innovation. That is our job. But many other products that the NHS needs can come through by reliance or recognition. So from 1st of January, again, a big culture shift. We are going to be relying on the FDA, on Japan, on the EU still, of course. We know very well how that works. And our access countries. And when I say access, we're a fully paid up member of Australia, Canada, Singapore and Switzerland. And more are queuing up to join, including those that were having hospitality from King Charles this week, South Korea. So let's look to that international forum for patients. And I could say more about genomics. We're in partnership with Genomics England. We've got the newborn study, clearly extremely interesting for preemptive health, the way licensing works. And we're in a partnership arrangement with Genomics England on adverse drug reactions, the first world biobank of adverse drug reactions that will reduce, I think it's the equivalent of 2 800-bedded hospitals full every year from adverse drug reactions. Lord O'Shaughnessy, you challenged me on, do I know what's happening on the trials? I can't tell you about recruitment. We must get that dashboard that you recommended up and running. What I can say, though, is that we're authorising now, not in the statutory 30 days, 24, for amendments 12. So bring us the trials and you will get a quick answer. So that's what your study has, your report has stimulated. And I hope that it will be okay to tell everybody. When I talked with the head of the Japanese agency in Australia last week, what are they wanting to talk about? James O'Shaughnessy's review. It's had traction worldwide because they too want to see commercial studies, reaching the potential that they should do. So much more to do. We need the right people in regulation. When I say it's an exciting career, regulation, people say that doesn't go in the same sentence, but it is. We need the best minds in areas like genomics, in AI, maybe not for the whole career. Maybe it can be the best part of your career. Our performance we're watching with laser-like focus. Let's get the right people and we can do the job. So life sciences, making the UK the life science superpower, yes, we can.
Thank you very much. I have the very invidious task of following 3 eminent heavyweights, and just to start with an apology why I was late, I actually got stuck in a security alert just outside Downing Street. So sorry about that. It wasn't me. I wasn't doing anything on tour. I was actually just promoting excellent life sciences. But really pleased to be here. And I just want to say a couple of thank yous to, first of all, Mr. Reform, and also to George, who, as James said, has been a really excellent life sciences minister. Really, really important, actually, in terms of the genesis of some of the thinking behind the strategic partnership that Moderna has in place with government and indeed other deals. And always someone we could go to with ideas around innovation, doing things differently. And I think what you've heard today so far is that's really important, in terms of Whitehall and government, in terms of how we make sure this vision becomes a reality and it gets implemented. So thank you, George, for what you have done. I just want to pick up on the point you made around access and speed of access, which I think is really important and something the UK can be an exemplar in. And I want to focus on 3 things, which picks up on all of the comments made today. So let's start with the MHRA. June doing a great job, and you've just heard some really important areas of innovation and enterprise that the MHRA are looking at, particularly around looking ahead to platform technologies and how can we speed up regulation. Absolutely safety first always, but doing that in a way that can ensure patients and the population as a whole get much quicker access to treatments. like James mentioned, we're now actually on the brink of moving towards personalised healthcare, which is really exciting. But with that, we do need to think about the type of regulation, and that requires a legal change, but also a cultural change, a mentality change, a mindset change. And that's as much on the industry, by the way, as it ever could be on the regulator in terms of how we're designing clinical trials, how we're interacting with the regulator quickly. And whenever I speak to politicians, and we've also been making this case to the opposition as well, it's really important that the MHRA, and by the way, I get excited about regulation, as does my colleague Kat at the front, and that might say more about us than anyone else, but it is really important in the sense that the MHRA shouldn't be seen as like a cost centre or a regulator. It needs to be seen as an investment centre. It needs to be seen as an enabler. So if you think about a life sciences vision, or more to the point, as the Prime Minister calls it, a life sciences superpower, the MHRA is really, really important. It's a cornerstone and it's a keystone as part of that vision and to make that a reality. So investment in the MHRA is key. It's great to see that there has been more investment and we're dealing with capacity. But as we deal with capacity, we need to think about capability. It's not to say MHRA doesn't have great people, it does, but it's to continue that push to be number one to get the speed of access George said. Second thing, James's review. James has been good enough to listen to me a number of times. He's probably got tinnitus now from hearing me talk about it. But actually the report is genuinely fantastic. If you haven't read it, I really encourage you to read it. 27 very clear diagnostics and areas of prescription. Good to see the implementation plan published yesterday. I suppose to coin a phrase, we need to get O'Shaughnessy done now. That's the probably better than what happened. It does. Maybe we can work on the phrasing there a little bit. But anyway, the sentiment's key, and that is really, really important because if we talk about clinical trials, we must remember that clinical trials are more than just about scientific progress and scientific endeavour. It's actually about people's health. Yeah. It's about population health. All of the evidence shows people in a clinical trial have better health outcomes because they're routinely monitored more. You pick up on things more quickly, risk factors. For some people, it can be a life or death situation. There's no other alternative. So this is really important. And as James knows, because we've been discussing this, there is a piece to be done around inclusion diversity, which James does touch upon in his report, and that's something else we do need to ensure that we focus on, but we do Lord O'Shaughnessy's report brilliantly, but we make sure it benefits everyone. Yeah. That's really, really important. And the final point, I know George has actually had great ideas on this for a long, long time, and I think this is going to become more prominent as we proceed, and that's around HTA reform. And I know Jill's in the audience, and we've had a chat about this previously. This could be another elephant in the room if we're not careful, because we are going to be bringing forward across the industry a range of different types of innovation, and that pricing equation could get very tricky. I think we do have to start looking at the HJ framework and say, well, could this be a bit like taking a knife to opening a can of baked beans? And we want to avoid that. And there are things like around the threshold. The threshold hasn't changed since 1999. There's been no inflationary adjustment to that £20,000 to £30,000 per quality. That's not really sustainable if you want to be a superpower. There's got to be some fairness there. There's got to be some meeting in the middle. And yes, again, the industry has a role to play there. To think differently about how it can bring products forward, think differently about the types of pricing offer and the pricing mechanism. So I'm not under any circumstances suggesting this is all on government and the HJ bodies. It isn't. And I think it speaks to the types of partnerships we see done. That we can do it. We can square the circle. And I see in the audience a few former VTFers. I was on the vaccines task force, and that's how we kind of did it. I know it was an emergency situation. I know it was different, but that showed a way of thinking, a way of doing things, and I think that's going to be really, really important as we proceed. But I'd just like to thank everyone on the panel, because I've got 3 people here who have really, really been pushing this issue, and I'm very grateful for that.
Thanks very much. That was an extremely comprehensive and optimistic conversation. I felt that despite covering some of the problems, I feel very optimistic about the future of life sciences now, which is an unusual sentiment when often we discuss healthcare in this country. It's always around, this idea of polycrisis, but I feel like we're on the cusp of something, which is nice. So let's open up to questions from the audience. Does anyone have any questions for our esteemed panel? No? Oh.
Thank you. I wasn't going to go first, but nobody else was. I'm Gillian Lang, previously at NICE, now doing a range of different things. I like the 3 questions: why, what, how. And we know that life science is important, but why is it important? I think, James, you answered that in many ways. It's about money through all sorts of different routes, and of course, better outcomes for patients, better healthcare. But there's a lot of that that's about bringing in money for the country. So what do we do? We've alluded to lots of different challenges in the system, haven't we? Although some of what we do is brilliant, there are challenges with not enough R&D, we're not good at scaling up startups, data sharing's been problematic, regulation, HTA have its problems, payment models, uptake in the NHS, the whole raft of new things that are coming down the track that are hugely expensive, like cell and gene therapies. There's a massive list of the things that we need to be able to do as part of the what. So the next bit of that, the how, is the tricky bit. And George, you said we need to have some radical thoughts on the model, and that's what I think we need to be brave enough to do. It's innovation. Innovation isn't just the techie bit. Innovation is how we deal with all of this, and we need to step back and think, this is what we want to achieve, this is why we want to do it. How do we do it perhaps radically differently from the future? Let's be brave.
Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, well, one of the joys of being off the front bench is I can now answer that. I agree, and I think we've all been very polite, but it is line 1 urgent. If we don't diffuse this structural health deficit time bomb, I say that because in the 13 years I've been in Parliament, health has gone from about 30% of total government expenditure to it's now about 40 odd, 42.
Yeah, more.
So, and in Norfolk it is bankrupting us. We're the first county that will have more pensioners than non-pensioners. So this is out. So the place bit I think does matter, but I agree with you that from a life science industry, the key is disease, and that's why. Let me share with you the sort of. I think we ought. I have a sort of idea of a sort of dream health state, and you'll all have different visions, but this is the conversation I think we need to have. Not least because if collectively policymakers, commentators, leaders have a shared vision of what an enlightened healthcare innovation economy looks like, you're halfway to getting there. But if everyone's disagreeing about that, we're never going to get there. So I dream of a world in which we've really localised healthcare. By the way, the Labour Party, when they debated setting up the NHS, there was a big debate internally. Half said it should be local, integrated, it should include care, and the whole life cycle. It shouldn't be medicine, it should be care. And the Bevanite said, no, we're going to nationalise it, we're going to create the National Health Service and stuff their mouths with gold, and it'll never be stoppable. Well, it hasn't. So I just think there's something in that kind of localisation piece. And certainly, if we set out a framework and said, look, in this geography, big city, conurbation, county, whatever, over the next 10 years, that's what the health deficit is going to do. I'm sure we've got these numbers, that's why they're cutting everything else. If you collectively could reduce the rate of increase, not less spend less, but just reduce the rate of increase, we'll let you keep, half the saving. All the evidence actually is that 10% saving is fundamentally motivating. Not for Porsches, but to go back into your healthcare system. I think that would be transformational in 80% of places. Certainly in Norfolk, the 3 hospital leaders get together and say, did he just say we could take the 110 people out of the NNN, the 100 out of the James Paget, the 100 people who shouldn't be in hospital out, that's 300 beds, turn them into research beds, get some incoming. So I think firstly a different model of incentive-based healthcare. With some proper health economics, I think one of the things the pandemic revealed is we've reduced health economics to the sort of reductio ad absurdum. Is a syringe more valuable than a plaster? Health economics is about how healthy is this population, how productive is this economy, and boy did we learn the cost of disease and the value of health, right? And I remember when I first became minister, I went to meet the team who did the quality, and the poor statistician was dragged up to the ministerial floor in DH, never see the light of day. And I said, look, I dropped out of statistics at Cambridge, but try me. What is the quality? How does it work? And you probably all know this. They take the entire spectrum of health, from a plaster to the most expensive chemotherapy, from your first pregnancy test to your end of life care, the whole sum, and then they do some really weird averaging to come up with what the average life extension is of the average intervention. It's completely meaningless. It's a meaningless statistical thing, which they then announce as a health economic value benchmark. I mean, it's not. And so I think there's a health economics piece. And my dream would be that now that we've given the NHS the freedom to say no for itself, it's perfectly good at doing that. NICE is liberated to be a proper global health economics house. And I'd love NICE to be able to say that will save you lives and money, fast track it. That'll save you lives, and if you change your care pathway, it would probably save you money. We recommend you trial it, change your care pathway in a few places. This will definitely save you lives, could save you money, but we put it on a conditional approval and then do the pricing when we've worked out. This will never save you lives or money, no. And a much clearer pathway, so the jumbo jets, one size fits all, can land over there, and little light aircraft can land here with a lit runway. Unless we give NICE that freedom, I think the next generation of innovators are going to say, the NHS is like an aircraft carrier that only one side plane can land. So I think you have to do both the local incentives into healthcare innovation systems and the national HTA assessments, and then let 1,000 flowers bloom. And with data, you quite quickly say, why is Norfolk's cancer outcomes 10x worse than London? And then in goes the SWAT team and help out. But at the moment, I think if we don't do this, we ain't going to unleash the full value of all of this great innovation.
I just want to add a slightly different perspective, which is, so if you think, I sort of tend to think about this, try and think about this in sort of macroeconomic terms, or semi-microeconomic, I suppose, but if you think about the strengths of our economy, so the science base, our science base is obviously world leading, 4 of the world's top 10 universities. And what you find is, in the life sciences, the closer you get to both scale up commercialization on one hand, and access to or operating within the NHS, the harder it gets. So we have a shortage of growth capital, something we're admittedly trying to address, but a very reluctant ultimate customer. And so part of, part of reforming clinical trials is actually to just sort of push out that difficult boundary one more step at a time. So it's sort of slightly incrementalist approach. But it's obviously slightly unsatisfactory because you're moving across the entire health economy in an incrementalist approach. So I've been trying to think about how one could do it differently without trying to boil the ocean. And as we all know in this room, you have to view this life cycle of a medicine or a device or whatever it is, any kind of intervention, as a life cycle. It starts with sort of ideation, probably in a lab somewhere, and it ends up with hopefully everybody who could be using it. But if you have weak links in that chain, the whole thing breaks. And you've talked about NICE there, and it's one example because of the restrictions on it, how it can operate, but there are other ones. So again, you can't fix that across everything at once. So my thought is, how can you take 2 or 3 areas and try and fix all the links in the chain simultaneously so the whole thing functions? Now, we obviously sit on a commission together where we're looking at dementia care, and this could be one of them. Now, it's very big. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of patients, the prospect of new disease-modifying therapies, God knows how we're going to pay for them, definitely for innovation in financing models, let alone all the diagnostic and primary care capability that's required to get them to the people and to diagnose people in a timely way and to get them the drugs that are going to help them. It could be cancer vaccines. We have this amazing experience with vaccine manufacture and uptake during the pandemic. This is obviously a leap forward in terms of the actual underlying biological technology. It could be that. It could be something else. In a way, I don't really care. Let's just decide we're going to be incredibly good at every step in that life cycle, every link in the chain, in 2 or 3 areas, and demonstrate that we can do it, that we have the clinical trial accelerators to do it, that we actually have a different approach in NICE with the ability to have more generous thresholds, an accelerated route, even faster through the routes of the approval that June has just talked about, and of course uptake with the clinical community and then into communities and so on. I think that is how we will rebuild confidence. We did it in COVID, but we did it by stopping lots of other things. it is, in a way, it's an inspiration, but it's also a bit of a kind of monkey on our back, because it's an impossible thing to replicate at that kind of scale in those circumstances, because they were just completely unique. But we do need to do it in 2 or 3 meaningful disease areas where we have a scientific advantage, which are going to be growing in themselves and which relate to big health challenges that we have. And I think if we could just decide to do that and then follow it through with all those different links in the chain, we would rebuild our confidence in the ability to have a different kind of health system that draws on all those interventions, that hopefully pulls them, as George was saying, to a more preventative space, and that we can actually stop the inexorable rise of healthcare spending, which will overwhelm every single element of public spending in the next few decades.
Well, just to say, we actually have a plan. We need to execute it. It is on the life cycle model. We've got in our grasp 3 areas, haven't we? Cancer, obesity, and dementia. And that's the route forward. Yeah. It isn't going to be simple, but we have the clarity now. We've got the map, we've got the direction, and we've got the specifics. And I think between us, if we can put away some of the territorial stuff that actually the Vaccine Task Force managed to do, we will do this.
Just wrapping up, I mean, George and I have discussed this a number of times. I agree completely with what he said, and by the way, I'm taking your analogies as I go, because they're particularly good. I mean, as someone who's a health economist by background and has been involved with NICE and the HJ bodies, I think what you said is so correct, that this idea that quality is a quality, it isn't. When you actually look at the reality of an opportunity cost, and the threshold is a problem, you know, as I said before, at a basic level it hasn't been adjusted since 1999. We're effectively trying to generalise that opportunity cost to the NHS. Then we've got into this sort of fudge factor, well, end of life care, we need to do something here, we need to change it there. I think we need to radically rethink how we're assessing along the lines of what you said, and that won't be perfect. There's lots of heterogeneity and uncertainty, but I think that gives a better signal to the industry, and it allows for better collaboration with the system. And also, at the moment, we effectively only look at the opportunity costs on the healthcare system. And to your point, the pandemic proved that actually the opportunity cost is much wider. Now, there are methodological data challenges around extending that analysis, but you know, there's a bit of the JFK here, isn't it? We don't do things because they're easy, we do them because they're hard. We should be saying, okay, we appreciate that's challenging, but we should be doing it because we know there's a load of value being left off the table, which then when you think about health inequalities and health disparities, we're not optimising the policy there. So I think that HJ reform bit is really key and must be forefront as we proceed.
Just sorry, very quick. Just one other thought, which is one thing that the unfortunately the Hallett review into COVID won't look at, I suspect, is your point, George, about health economies. And I don't know how many deaths we avoided, or we think we avoided, as a result of the lockdowns and so on. But let's say it's 1 million, 200,000.
Well, I remember that first October, but I mean that's ancient history. JBT and Patrick showing a graph.
It's the first time ministers had seen it. 450,000 people dead within.
So that was the Ferguson stuff.
6 months. And then we were told that if we got a vaccine out really quickly, you could sort of halve that. But I mean, there may be other data.
But I mean, but we probably spent about £500 billion in one way or another, let alone all the costs which we haven't accounted for, like the impact on school children and the long-term scarring for workforce participation and so on. So do the maths. We spent a lot more because we thought it mattered. Well, I think we probably, by and large, think that that was the right thing to do. So why aren't we spending that on other things? And that is sort of the thing that is fascinating to me. And you won't, I bet the phrase health economics doesn't even get used in the review. You know, I mean, what an amazing missed opportunity that is.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. I'll go for this young lady here.
Thank you. It's Holly from GSK. In the opening, James spoke about the importance of really getting the accountabilities right in terms of clinical trials and the MHRA. Question to all panellists really, how do you see that actually working in practice? What do you think the right way to get those accountabilities looks like?
Should we take the second question now? I think it's just that gentleman behind you here.
Hi, It's really just a question of the panel. Do you think we can start instrumenting change from the bottom up? Is there something we can do regionally rather than everything centrally? Because centralisation has failed many times. I'm Dean Morton, I'm from the University of Birmingham. I've actually opened trials in over 100 countries, and I promise you that the central regulation is not the key barrier in this country. And actually it's the local setup and the local drivers. So echoing George's thoughts, do you think we could actually reinstitute a regional policy where they prioritise the diseases that Lord O'Shaughnessy has referred to? They decide what they're going to prioritise in Norfolk. I'm so tempted to say old people, George, but but I think they make their priorities, and then they drive the trusts in their area to prioritise and deliver on that, and then we incentivise them through that, because I think that will work, and I don't think central top-down will work. I'm sorry.
Great.
Can I take that and I'll leave the other person? So it's a bizarre and weird and frustrating reflection of mine that having given up a career 15 years ago to get to the lever of power at the top of government, you pull it and nothing happens. So I was always a pretty profound localist. I'm now a really committed localist. And the reason I believe in the X and the Y axis of disease portals, if we could be the first country to put, 500,000, 1 million dementia patients on one platform with the ability to slide a bar and say, enroll me in trials, transformational for industry, but at the same time could allow, let's say, Glasgow, Greater Manchester, the West Midlands, to be 3 place-based health economic pathfinders, where you actually measure the cost of disease for the whole life cycle in that area. You could then begin to create some place-based incentives that would really drive local leadership and exactly the model that James has just talked about. Fortunately, the Treasury have done some numbers. There's a helpful number. It's probably wrong, but it's a Treasury number, so we'll go with it. They say that the cost of obesity in the West Midlands area, Greater West Midlands, is $4.5 billion a year. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but let's just take it because it's a Treasury number. If that's right, then I put it to everyone that if we said, if you, Andy Street, with a group locally, could reduce that number, you can keep half the saving. You then create, it's a local investment bond, as long as you've got proper leadership governance, a structure where you could start to say, could you Medtronics help us work out which the people are quickly? Could you help us? And it would really accelerate the quicker, easier, low-hanging fruit. And I think it would then give us 3 cities, and you say, how come Manchester did so well? You might even get the football clubs competing. You make it something that's it's like an Olympic challenge. So place and disease, I think, would really move this on. I've sat in the Whitehall with the finest minds trying to give ourselves permission to allow the data to flow, and the finest minds in Whitehall couldn't give ourselves permission. So I say, let patients have permission through charities, through the governance of patient-empowered charitable research, and I think it'll start to flow much more quickly.
Render unto Whitehall what is Whitehall's, and render unto Norfolk what is Norfolk's. I mean, we don't want a load of regional MHRAs, right? So there are certain things that have to be done centrally. National contracting actually is one of those examples where you can eliminate lots of duplications as sort of national solution to a local problem. But generally speaking, I agree with your analysis. And one of the things I have done since the review was published, being off to speak at various places, is to say, what are you waiting for? You don't need permission for most of this stuff. You can just get on with it, whether you're Birmingham or Manchester or Norfolk or the Southwest or wherever. So much of this stuff can be done yourself, which does revert back somewhat to the question about accountability. And again, I was really shocked that it was impossible to get a comprehensive real-time view of what clinical trials were happening, despite the fact that all that information sits in a variety of different bodies, private, public sector, and other. And you can't run a system if you don't know what's going on, or a system can't run itself if you don't know what's going on. So I made a suggestion that we should commission a clinicaltrials.uk, this is an American version, which have a UK version, truly comprehensive, all phases of trials, all across the UK, deep data on inclusion, exclusion criteria, genomic profiling, and all the rest of it. And I'm happy to say the government is going to commission that, and that will come into being in 2025, which feels a bit too far away, but it's actually not bad. It's only 15 months away. And think about what that will bring. First of all, for patients, instead of having to ask a friend because you don't know where to find a clinical trial, you can go onto it and find that clinical trial. You can volunteer to be part of observational cohorts in the way that George was talking about. If you're a clinician that's not involved in research, you can find out where that research is to tell your patient. If you're a clinician that are, you can find out who's high performing, where you'd want to collaborate with, if you're industry, where to cite your trials, and if you're the taxpayer, if you're government, local or national, what's going on, how do we hold people accountable to create, as you said, that very positive arms race on performance. And that is basic public sector reform 101. And that is nothing, there's nothing kind of, revolutionary about any of that. And I do think that once people know what is going on and they can do something about it, the transformational power of that for people who want to do the right thing, which by the way, virtually everybody, is extraordinary. And that is just waiting to be unleashed.
That is the best incentive. Going back to Holly's question about accountabilities, I think accountabilities are clear, but people have believed them so much that they will not work across boundaries. The first time I learnt that lesson, it was actually with Lord Warner and a certain issue that you insisted that we dealt with NICE and the MHRA simultaneously, and that worked. So the outcome was what was needed. We are not focused enough on outcomes. My staff who do clinical trials don't know at all what you were asking for. Recruitment, whether the trial was successful. I was astonished when I looked into that. If I was working in clinical trials, I'd want to know. I'd be waking up every day. Now, I know because of what I hear that your question, exam question, why aren't we as good as Spain? We are now better than Spain in some areas because of what you did. So we must be incentivised by the outcome and own it.
I'll just be really quick. I just think James' point about the local and having certain areas which can almost be like exemplars is going to be important. We need people aware of the captain's armband a little bit and say, look, it can be done, we can go. And the incentives point, again, you can read it in James' report, that's really important because actually clinical trials can actually be profit making for the NHS, given the financial position of the NHS. And as we look ahead, that's really important because it's not making money anywhere really. So clinical trials, there is a virtuous circle, so that's something that should also be remembered.
Well, thank you so much to our excellent panellists and for some brilliant questions. This has been a really informative and, like I said, optimistic and uplifting discussion. So thanks very much. And please join us for coffee and tea and some brief networking after this if you have time. Thanks, everyone.